Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast that interviews researchers to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines. I'm your host, Mariam Shah, a mental health researcher and assistant psychologist working in NHS services, and a young person advisor at King's College London.
And I'm Dr. Catherine Bates, a youth development and mental health researcher at King's College London.
And this is the Science or Fiction podcast. Today's episode is very special as we're going to be exploring a bit more about how the Science or Fiction podcast came about. As an avid listener of the podcast, I'm delighted to be hosting this interview today, as we'll be getting to hear a bit more from Catherine about her experiences as a youth development researcher and how her time working with the team at King's has informed her insights into science communication and the development of this podcast. With multiple platforms for accessing the news, such as new forms of social media being made available today, our access to scientific findings has increased. But I found that this has made it even more difficult for me to understand whether what we're reading is actually science or fiction. As one of the young person advisors for the team, I've had the opportunity to contribute to the way in which scientific findings have been communicated to young people. Today we'll be hearing from Catherine about her motivations for ensuring that science is communicated in a trustworthy and understandable way across all age groups. Hi Catherine, how are you today?
I'm nervous. No, I'm good. It's just a bit weird being the one being interviewed instead of asking the questions, but I'm excited. Thanks for hosting this.
Yeah, it must be quite a strange change from going from interviewer to interviewee.
Yeah, I feel really on the spot. I feel I now have some sympathy or empathy for the people that I interview now.
Well, the questions won't be too challenging today, so no worries. But yeah, we just thought it'd be really nice to learn a bit more about you. So thank you so much for joining today. And I'm really excited to learn a bit more about yourself in the podcast. I thought it'd be nice to begin by exploring where your inspiration for the name of the podcast, Science or Fiction, came from.
So the name itself, my partner actually came up with. It's just a play on the phrase science fiction. But yeah, I've been a bit unsure about the name since I started it. I do really like the Science or Fiction podcast. I think it's catchy, like people know what they're going to get. But it's probably important to point out that science is not synonymous with fact, and that's what it sounds like in the title. So I used to have a science, like, is it science or fiction question at the end of each podcast episode, but I don't ask that now because you can't really equate science with fact. So science is about testing predictions about the world, and a fact is a fact. A fact is like truth. But anyway, hopefully it's catchy and it draws people in and gives people like an idea what the podcast is about.
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful answer from a very scientific perspective. But I think it's definitely a catchy title. So yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of presenting science and fiction, and not wanting to sort of be misleading in our science communication, what some of your motivations for creating the podcast were, and how that sort of overlaps with some of the interests I know you have in communicating science, particularly to young people in this way.
I think particularly with young people, it kind of came from a feeling that science is not always accessible, or research specifically, and also research specifically about mental health. That's how I felt when I first started working in research. But really, like, science is not just for academics. Like, science is for everyone, and especially research findings about psychology, the brain, mental health, behavior, like that is for everyone, so that we can be like informed in the way that we live our lives. And I was like, for example, I was the first person in my family to go to university. So this world of like science and research was really new to me. And I found it quite baffling that research did feel like it was just for people that worked in universities. Like the way that we publish scientific papers in scientific journals with all this like, specific terminology. Obviously there's some need for that, but it just felt like it was very exclusive. So I think that's why I resonate with young people in this way, because that's how I felt as a young person who was new to science. And then in terms of starting the podcast and thinking about aiming my science communication at young people, I think it was during the pandemic that I started to think about these things, because that brought with it a lot of discussion around young people's mental health. Like, we suddenly became a lot more aware of how young people were being affected and what kind of impact this like situation was going to have. We also at the same time had a lot more people contributing to this conversation via like TikTok, new forms of social media, which can be really great because you get to hear people's different perspectives, but this can also lead to a lot of misinformation. So really what I wanted to do, or what I'm trying to do with the podcast, is empower young people with knowledge about research methods and scientific methods and how we conduct science. And that's why we pick a paper to discuss in each episode, to like give us the chance to explain the differences, for example, between like quantitative and qualitative data, or between causal or correlational evidence. Like, I think we need to empower young people and the public in general with this knowledge of the research and scientific methods, so that when we are consuming information in the media, we can evaluate that for ourselves. Like, is this an alarmist headline, or is there strong evidence to back it up? We have the power to judge that ourselves. So I just think that's really important when we're trying to like protect our mental health, or think about the future, or make decisions like about our behavior. Like, knowledge and being able to evaluate the information we're consuming is important.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think something you mentioned there about beginning this journey into more of a scientific career, and then realizing how exclusive of a club it actually is, because once you're immersed a bit more in this world, it becomes so normal to think, oh, I'd love to get a journal article published. And then when I tell my mum about that, she's like, what? Where are you getting published? Where can I read it? Will it be in the news?
Yeah.
And so that those different forms of communication and sort of the legitimacy and power behind those findings is, really, I agree, really important to communicate, especially to younger audience.
Yeah, and like while I was doing my PhD, for example, everything did start to become more accessible, because now a lot of scientific journals, you publish your findings open access, meaning like anyone can read it. And that's like a new thing, but that's not enough. Like, you can't say like it's accessible because anyone can read it. Like, most people won't know what a scientific journal even is, or where to Google it, or whatever. I didn't know anything like that until I started in this job. So yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure that it's not too exclusive.
And I was wondering, in terms of the way that sort of media platforms and ways of communicating science have transformed over the past few decades, how do you think that our ability to communicate these scientific findings has changed through these platforms such as TikTok, or sort of more short form media platforms?
So I think it's definitely changed a lot in recent years. What we can do about it and how we adapt in science communication is a really hard question. I think that we need to take more responsibility as scientists. Like, I think it can start really early on. So in terms of writing summaries about our articles, like abstracts with science articles, they should be written in a way that's understandable, and also without too many big claims in there, so that if someone only reads those 200 words, they're not going to get like a misrepresentation of what the findings were. So it can start that early on, but then obviously you can get all the way down the stages to like a video on social media. I think we also need to hold content creators accountable. So like example I was thinking about recently is that a lot of my feed on TikTok is recipes. So like I'll see a 30-second or 1 minute clip of someone cooking like something delicious in this really nicely edited video. And then they say at the end, like, see the comments for the recipe, or the recipe's in the link in my bio. And 9 times out of 10, I can't cook that meal without checking that recipe and understanding like what are the ingredients, what are the measurements. So why do we not expect the same amount of information or have the same standards for mental health information or for science information? I could think content creators should be providing that information, and we should also expect it from them. So we shouldn't see like a 30-second video telling me about some scientific fact about what's going to make my brain healthy and take that as fact without following it up with understanding the evidence. And I think that's the content creator's responsibility, and also partly our responsibility as well for looking that up. There's a podcast that I really like called ADHD Babes, and they interview people and share their experiences as women and non-binary people with ADHD. And one of their guests recently, who had recently been diagnosed with ADHD, like as an adult, she said she found social media like really helpful in trying to understand like different characteristics of ADHD. But she said to only use it to open a door and not to use it for any more than that. And I think that's the same point. Like if you're curious about something that you've seen on social media, and it's really important to go and do some research on it and read around the evidence. And I guess that's what I'm trying to do with the podcast. That like I'd hope that if someone was looking for more information on a topic, they might come across a half-an-hour episode of it on our podcast, and they can find out more from that. And then we mention resources, and if they want to, they can go to the website and like look at the resources from there. So I think it's really changing a lot, and I think we have quite a long way to go to fully answer this question. And I think it's more about like the kind of regulations and accountability we can have in place of content creators and the way that we're kind of putting information out there. And again, like teaching people like the critical evaluation skills and teaching people about the scientific method so that we can be skeptical and we can be curious when we see this information, I think is what's going to be really important.
Yeah, I really like that idea of making these content creators a bit more accountable. And even if that level of accountability is just to provide sort of evidence-based resources, then it feels like quite a simple thing to implement, but could go a long way. But I think in terms of even this content, it's quite transformative in terms of how critical it is enabling the listeners to think. And so there is a little bit of a difference there where you're sort of providing skills that are going to be able to help people in terms of how they're evaluating what they further go on to interact with. So I think, awesome. You're doing a brilliant job here.
Thanks. That's so nice to hear. I'm glad that you agree with like the critical point. That's something I'm really trying hard to do.
And you've kind of touched on this a little bit now in terms of some of these really prevalent topics that are going around that I think in my experience others have shied away from in terms of touching on more stigmatized topics, like when you did the loneliness episode, or even ones that are a bit more controversial in the scientific community, like the mindfulness episode. And so not only does this sort of make for interesting episodes, but I found it really effective in demonstrating the power of science communication and having a balanced argument and seeing these different things from two sides. And so I've just been wondering, what's your approach to selecting topics for the podcast then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's I guess there's two main ways that I do it. One of them is that I try to just pick topics that are like really relevant in the news. So I started doing this a few years ago. I write articles for a platform called Bold Ideas, and I write like evidence-based articles about stuff that's in the news, basically, about like learning and development. And that's how I kind of came up with this idea that we need to like pick up on things that people are talking about and just explain it in a bit more detail. So like the mindfulness example, that was off the back of like a huge study with like 100,000 young people, where they found mindfulness training in schools did not significantly reduce anxiety and depression. And that was all over the news. So that was where that came from. With loneliness, you're right, like this is it's a really hard topic to discuss. It's quite stigmatizing, but again, it's been in the news quite a lot. People are talking about loneliness a lot, especially since the pandemic. So that's one way that we do it. And then some topics come from direct conversations with young people. So when I started the podcast, Afra, who interviewed with me on episode 5, I think, she worked with me as a youth advisor, providing her lived experience as a young person. And she also ran focus groups with young people. And this was basically to find out, like, what should this podcast look like? If you're going to listen to a podcast about this, what format would you want it to be in? Should it be an interview? Should it be panels, etc.? And also, what topics do you want us to cover? So a lot of the topics are kind of directed from that as well, like what young people are interested in and what they want to know about. So yeah, I'd say those are the two main ways to do it.
And I think one thing that you do really effectively is bringing in experts from a wide range of fields, so that there's not just your perspective, but some expert sort of knowledge to bring in, and it creates sort of really interesting discussions. And I was wondering, from creating and conducting those interviews, what you've learned, or maybe what surprised you the most from some of those discussions you've had.
Yeah, that's a really good question. What's been really nice is just like how well people can talk about their science in like an accessible way, because these are quite often topics like that I'm not an expert in, because there's such a wide range. And it is so nice to hear people explain these like complicated things in an accessible way. That's been really nice. I think some of the statistics have been really shocking. Like, for example, Ulrika Schmidt said that they think that at least 80% of people with eating disorders don't come forward for help. And I did that interview like 2 years ago, and that's really stuck in my head. Like, things like that have been really surprising. In terms of like, because I do a lot of research obviously for each episode to try and figure out what we should discuss. And quite a nice surprise has been that a lot of news coverage of mental health is actually quite good. So I started the podcast being like very skeptical and being ready to, you know, like take down the news and actually like the articles can be really balanced. So like, for example, the social prescribing headline, which is like episode 9, was young people will be prescribed surfing and dancing for anxiety. That's quite a kind of a scary headline, especially for a young person who's potentially in the midst of like a mental health crisis on a waiting list for support. They might read a headline like that and be worried, like, what does this mean? Like, am I going to get the help that I need? But then the article itself is quite balanced, and they explain whether there's evidence or not. So like, that has been quite a nice surprise, that I kind of now, instead of, you know, being overly critical, we are providing like the information that's not in the article. So I still think there's a problem with there not being enough information. Like, the articles are often so short. Like, they even have that like thing at the top that says like 2-minute read, 3-minute read, because they're just trying, like, the news is still the news. They're still trying to catch your attention. There's always going to be headlines that are not, you know, accurate of the situation. But yeah, so that has also been a nice surprise, I think.
Yeah, that's really like heartening to hear that some of these sort of more misleading titles that we've come across in the past, there's been a different approach in how the media itself is presenting them, and trying to balance, you know, what they require as a media outlet in order to get people in, but also creating sort of a more fair argument when it comes to reading the article content. And so I was just wondering if there's been any sort of influences from doing these podcasts on your research, or even how you yourself are now consuming science communication.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in terms of the impact on my research, so I started this, I guess, just over 2 years ago now, and got like a small grant to be able to pay a youth advisor to be involved. And I learned so much from having a young person involved and getting young people's input, that it really opened my eyes to how having like non-academics involved in your projects can be really informative and really helpful. And we now do that in like basically all of our research. We have like youth co-researchers, and we're always looking for ways now to like collaborate with people outside of academia, so like charities, young people, whoever we're doing research about, we try to have them involved. So that has been really cool, and it's like so fun to get all the different perspectives. So I also presented to like the King's Youth Advisory Group, which is like young people with mental health conditions, and they're a group that give feedback to like all different researchers over King's who are interested in like presenting to them. So I presented to them again this year and like let them know like what I'd done based on their previous feedback, and like we had a discussion about what to do next. And it's just so exciting. It's such a cool way to like develop ideas, and I think the podcast is like infinitely better from having different people's input. So I would say that's like probably the biggest influence on my work.
Yeah, and even from my perspective, it's really nice to see how not only are you involving young people to get their ideas and opinions, but then taking that advice and showing how it's been implemented. So yeah, I think that's been really nice. I have one final question, and that's before we end, I'm sure the listeners would love to hear a bit more about your plans for the podcast this year and what we can look forward to hearing about.
Yeah, so I'm trying to branch out a little bit. So part of the feedback that I've had from young people is that like the podcast content doesn't need to be about young people's mental health or about young people for it to be interesting for young people. So I'm going to try and branch out a little bit into other parts of like psychology and science. So keep an eye out for that. And we are also planning a really exciting live podcast recording in the autumn, which you'll be able to get tickets to. So super excited for that as well. So there'll be information about that soon.
Yeah, all sounds really exciting. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I think I've learned a lot both about yourself and the podcast. So yeah, it's been really nice to speak today. Thank you.
Thanks for interviewing me and for such good questions. You could have my job.
I don't think I'm there yet, but maybe one day. It's been great to have the opportunity to host today, and thank you all for listening. You can follow us for updates and more information on Instagram and TikTok at Science or Fiction Pod, and on X/Twitter at Sci or Fiction Pod. If you want to get in touch or have any suggestions for a future topic, you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. And always, you can find the researchers' recommendations and links to support at www.scienceorfiction.co.uk. Thank you to the youth advisory groups for their input on this series, and thank you to Kit Studio for the branding and to Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.